morning, colleagues. Thank you for attending this convocation session on a changing landscape of developmental mathematics education. Today, we are pleased to welcome Dr. Uri Treisman, a professor of mathematics and public affairs at the University of Texas at Austin. Dr. Treisman is the founder and executive director of the Charles A. Dana Center, an organized research unit of the College of Natural Sciences at the University of Texas. His research and professional interests span mathematics and science education, education policy, social and developmental psychology, and community service and volunteerism. Dr. Treisman is truly an advocate for access, equity, and excellence in education for all students. Today, Dr. Treisman will share with us his expert opinion about new approaches to support struggling students and developing their ability to persist in the face of struggle. He will also review the current state of developmental education reform and review the evidence for the highest profile instructional strategies in developmental mathematics. With that, I ask that you give your full attention to Dr. Treisman and help me in welcoming him.
Thank you.
Dr. Treisman.
Wow, were those fantastic talks. I think you're lucky to have your president who spoke with incredible clarity and focus, and I think the keynote speaker with tremendous humanity and purpose. And what did it really reoriented my thinking about how to organize this talk. So let me just start with the personal, because I think it's directly relevant to the work I'm going to talk about. So when you look at him or you look at me, or when our students look at someone who looks like me or him, balding white guy whose tie isn't exactly the best match for his jacket, right, approaching 70, what do they think? Almost all my students assume, because I've asked them, that I came from privilege, that I was raised to be a mathematician, and I was just basically determined to be so. In fact, I started at age 24 at Pierce Community College in the horticulture program. It was the 60s. Some of you remember the 60s. I was out of work, I had a young family, and I needed a job. And I went in, I heard about community college. It was $6 a semester then in California. And I actually did not eat lunch so I could pay the fee. You know, I had to save the $6. And I went in and I saw an advisor. And she said to me, well, what do you want to be? I said, anything that'll get me a job. And she said, what do you like to do? I said, I like to hike. She said, you're in the horticulture program, gardening. You'll be outside every day. Well, I did it. Got a certificate in horticulture. I worked for 5 years in grounds and maintenance in Los Angeles Community College campuses, mostly in gardening, some repair. But I love math and numbers because my mother had a 4th grade education, but she loved number games. So that's what we'd play around the kitchen table. So I wanted to hear numbers and math. So there was a temporary building, 50 years later, still a temporary building at the Los Angeles Community College campus. And I would take my lunch outside the building because the windows were open. It was Los Angeles, I could hear the math. And Jack Stutzman, the professor, came out, he saw the gardener, and he invited me to eat my lunch in the classroom. And he told the students that they could also eat the lunch that period in the classroom because he knew I couldn't do it if I couldn't eat my lunch. He asked me to do the homework, he graded it, gave me encouragement, hired me as a tutor for his class the next semester, brought me over to what was then Valley State College. Now it's like the Interplanetary University of Northridge, a massive name inflation. Got me a job with his cousin, Malcolm Sewell, who was finishing his PhD at UCLA, transferred up there. He then took me to Phil Curtis, the chairman of the math department at UCLA, and got me a scholarship to help me get some loans. And I just think about that. right? That he put this vision, because I had no idea what you could do with math as a job. I just thought you just sort of played with it. When he retired, I was invited to say some words at his party. And of course, I discovered there were like 20 or 30 other people he had done exactly the same thing for. And I said, I still can't call him Jack, right? Professor Stutzman, you have any idea how you transformed my life? And he said, look, teaching is a bitch. He said, whenever I had a really hard day, I would just pick a student and do something wonderful for them. And that particular day, you were the student I decided to do something wonderful for. And it's always like thrilled me that I could have this effect on individuals, but it's also really angered me that your future, your life should depend on an accident of me being nice on a particular day. And why shouldn't the system make it possible for everyone to have this experience as part of their everyday being on campus? So I get the enormous power of individual histories. And what's ironic is that very few community college faculty descend from privilege. Almost all of you or your families represent successful stories in upward mobility, and those stories are often invisible to our students and we don't share them. So you saw this beautiful set of films at the beginning by the Community College Center for Student Engagement. I'm on the board of that. And when I saw it, I wanted to show, I have the outtakes, the stuff we couldn't actually show, which are hysterically funny. And part of the reason we can't show them is because there's language which is not appropriate in Texas. But I'm thinking in New Jersey and New York, that language is everyday present. We should make special regional sets of them. But one of the things that's beautiful about the SESI data sets, so we survey more than 100,000 students. And when you look at successful students, more than half of them actually name a faculty member when you ask them about their success. Name an individual faculty member or more who they see as responsible for their success. With all this talk of structural reform, efficiency, system change, curriculum reorganization, the biggest thing I took away from the SESI data set and from the Community College Research Center, which was also mentioned before by your president, is that half the students who succeed are identifying a human being who actually helped them. Often faculty, sometimes in student services. It sort of depends on how you ask the question, it turns out. Who they actually, what job type they name. But with all the things I'm going to talk about structurally, the human bridge that we create to students' future, the idea that we put in their heads something they can be, is profoundly important role for us. So 74%, so last week's release of the current population survey of the Bureau of Labor Statistics came out, and it shows that 74% of people who recently got STEM certificates or degrees did not get jobs in STEM fields. So just about 3/4 of all the people who are successful in STEM don't actually get STEM jobs. And why is that when you look at community college students? So this is an active area of research. It's that students have succeeded in hunkering down and learning the skills, but they don't actually know anybody in these jobs. And they don't know anything about how to apply for these jobs, and they don't have the social networks that allow them to succeed and successfully get placed in jobs. Now, sometimes there are companies that are really good at getting past that and reaching out to students. But when you look at the national data, it's 74% of recent degrees haven't actually gotten a job in STEM. Disproportionately low-income people and disproportionately people of color. So when we think of reforming our system or improving our system, it's not just the content and the acceleration structures and delivery. It's actually the human bridge. The keynote speaker said we're a compass. We're both a bridge and a compass to better lives. So it's in that spirit that I make these remarks. Also, President Gibson talked about culture. So I visited 40 community colleges last year. And this is an exception because one of my rules is I go a day early to teach students. I teach for 3 or 4 periods. The only way to really get to know a campus is to actually be on it with the students. Because when you speak to the presidents, however honest they are, all community colleges sound identical. They all have learning communities. They all have accelerated programs. They're all moving to more statistics courses. They're all reorganizing student affairs and student services. They all have intrusive advising and mandatory orientation now. Almost all of them, 3/4 of them. And the others are coming on quickly, right? This is intentional practice. But when you're on the campuses, they feel radically different. Some of them feels like you're in a gas station in the Midwest. The students drive up, get filled up, and leave. And you see absolutely no student interactions with each other after class. And like 3 o'clock on Friday, no one's there. And then you go to Brazosport or Valencia or Walla Walla, and it feels like it's hard to know it's a college. It feels more like a community center, right? Enormous student engagement. So we're going to talk about developmental math and STEM programs, but it's the culture of an institution, the stickiness of it, that actually turns high-impact practices into student achievement. So I'm not so sanguine about the AAC and U project, because one of the main findings of the research and higher ed organization is that everybody has the high-impact practices in name and even in substance, including the colleges with the highest success rates and the lowest success rates. The question is, what is the catalyst that turns high-impact practices into scalable improvements in student achievement? It turns out to be relational trust, community, culture, students feeling like they belong, openness, and the sense that this is a place where they realize their aspirations. So when you look around, the problem with developmental math and remediation is not a lack of innovation. Every community college I've been at, people are, every day, all the time, people are pouring their hearts out and trying to improve their offerings. And Mahmoud here, the chair, I am sure that you're working as hard as you can to make things better for your students. You just don't choose to teach at a place like this if you're not doing that. But it turns out that the kind of innovations that we've been doing tend to be small in scale, often grant-funded, special initiatives, and almost none of them actually scale and affect normative practice. I was at a community college about this size in Ohio last year, and I spent a day with the math faculty and the deans, and we started with butcher paper, and people listed all the efforts in math to improve remediation, developmental ed. 81 programs they can name over their careers. We did descriptive statistics. They last 2 or 3 years each. About 1/3 of the faculty are always involved in them, and the rest are occasionally involved. And then at the end, I asked, how many of these had replaced existing things and became the normative way you do math education here? And the answer was 0. And driving to the airport, the vice president for academic affairs, the provost, was talking to me about the place. And I said, look, wasn't that really depressing? 81 things, some of them funded by you out of your budget to improve things, and none of them actually change your institutional practice. You still have 3 developmental math courses, or 3/4 of your GED students are starting over in arithmetic or elementary algebra. Doesn't that bother you? And he said, oh no, Uri, that's not stuff is not about institutional change. That's really about faculty development. So what are we seeing when we look at innovation? There are 5 things that people are working on, often in isolation. The first is content. So there's now generally regarded sense and policy statements of all the math associations, TIPSY-ME, MAA, Ubiquitous, AMATICS, Crossroads, that freshman math courses should actually be aligned to programs of study. They shouldn't be determined just by the weight of history and by historical practice. So I was one of the mathematicians who led the Algebra for All movement in the 70s. I didn't realize that for many of our students, we get algebra forever. 35,000 students 2 years ago in California took remedial algebra courses for the 5th or greater number of times. And as part of my SESI work, we've been interviewing EMTs, firemen, policemen, of which you produce a significant number in Newark. And what we're seeing is they're finishing all their courses and they get stuck on a college algebra or introduction to college math course. And that becomes the primary barrier. And you watch them and they're sitting there and trying to figure out how to factor creatively trinomials or rationalize binomial surd denominators. And it's an abomination because there's so much good mathematics that they could be learning that's actually relevant. And when you look at EMT and the Hobbit exam, there's almost no algebra on it. They're increasing the statistics on it now. The Nursing Association has just, Medical Association, AMA, is now recommending statistics rather than calculus. For the first survey of the mathematical practice, Conference Board of Math Sciences, this is the first 5-year study in which more students in pre-calculus and calculus are headed to health careers than engineering. All the mid-tier STEM jobs, many of them, but not all, require statistics. And many community colleges are shifting to a system where the math course fits the career program of study. CUNY this week released a randomized controlled trial study of the effectiveness of this, and they increased success rates of students by 50%, and the students in statistics took a national test to ensure it wasn't just easier grading. So the first thing people are working on is what is the content? We can't let the weight of history determine it. When you look at the Hobbit exam for EMT, or you look at the nursing certification exams, it's statistics and very basic algebra and deep number sense, proportionality that students need to know. So quantitative literacy courses with rigor, not courses that people could call our friends the numbers. Right? Not Mickey Mouse courses. Quant Lit, Stat, and a rethinking the mathematics you really need if you're going to study calculus. So just the last note on this. Now we have million student transcript databases. Many students take a pathway to pre-calculus because they may want to be engineers. About 10% of all students nationally who take pre-calculus ever pass first semester calculus. And if you're actually going to be an engineer, like a mechanical or electrical engineer, you need differential equations, linear algebra, Laplace transforms, the usual machinery of engineering. It's slightly less than 1% of students in college algebra ever take those, even enroll in those courses. So we've had a system in which students were funneled into courses to keep their options open, and those courses were actually burial grounds for the aspirations of students. The challenge is to make the other courses rigorous and have mathematical integrity, because if we sacrifice the disciplinary integrity of the courses, we will have betrayed our profession. And we're seeing lots of experimentation with this. The second is structure. So some places just work on the content and they get 30 to 50% improvement. Others are working on the structure. We know the national pattern is 3.4 is the mean number of courses in developmental math. So even if students were to pass, 80% of your students were to pass, and 80% were to enroll in the next course, we'd still only have about fewer than half the students even enrolling in a college credit course if they start at the bottom. Randomized controlled trials in North Carolina, Virginia, Texas, work at the Carnegie Foundation showed that many students are misplaced by placement exams, especially if they're rusty. And a lot of false positives and false negatives result. That many more, but by no means all, students can actually start in college-level material if they have more intensive mandatory support. And what we're seeing is better and better tools. They're not AccuPlacer, which is sort of a criminal enterprise. Even David Coleman, the new president, they're now acknowledging the false negatives and false positives, and they have a skunk's work to redesign AccuPlacer. I gave a talk in which I called it a criminal enterprise, and the next week I got calls from AccuPlacer and Compass to join their advisory boards. So $2 tests taken that students don't actually prepare for are mixing up students who are rusty with students who never learned. And the evidence now, well-documented, randomized controlled trials, shows that about 30 to 50% of students placed in DevEd intermediate algebra, elementary algebra, actually could pass statistics with a B or a college STEM preparatory course with a B if they have 2 to 4 hours of structured support in helping them do it. The lesson is that if students are going to succeed, more intensive structured help and fewer things, rather than stretching things out over a long period of time, works much better for the kind of students that we have in community colleges and that you're teaching here. If it takes a long time, life intervenes. Bad things happen, and nationally, 2/3 of all students in developmental math courses pass them. The problem is only about a half continue into the next course. So even if you had 80% pass rates, we're not going to succeed with the current structures. AMATIC, MAA have all made recommendations calling for the compression, acceleration of courses. The problem is the students who place into elementary arithmetic, and you have some who've never actually learned to multiply 2-digit numbers. And what we're seeing is that aside from highly contextualized workforce programs like iBest in Washington, no developmental courses work. And we need a national Manhattan project to figure out how to apply modern learning sciences to those courses. Because our studies of them show that they use outmoded technology, drill and practice, kids sitting in front of computers pushing buttons, and we can find no evidence of modern learning science or learning theory in any of the courses for the students in those classes, who, by the way, are disproportionately the poorest students and the ones who have the most to gain from earning a certificate or license with labor market value. So the first is the content. What are the evidence standards for the content in our courses? They now need to be reviewed against the programs of study, certificates, licenses, and transfer programs that you're offering. And by the way, almost all four-year colleges in New Jersey have 3 gateway math courses now. 20 years ago in the national survey, pre-calculus was 80% of the enrollment. If not forgetting the students who take calculus at the beginning, which you have very few of here. 80% of the pre-calculus students were taking pre-calculus as the gateway. This is the first year where it's a minority offering, 49%. Statistics is growing like wildfire, and high-quality quant lit courses are growing like wildfire. So transfer is not the problem we thought it would be anymore. And there are national recommendations in CUPM to support that. The third thing is delivery. Some people are using modern technology to deliver outdated instruction cheaply. And we're seeing almost no positive gains from the promises of technology always disappoint. Not to say that the technology solutions aren't getting better, but what we're noticing is that they're not silver bullets. I'm a Texan now, so I like to think of silver buckshot rather than silver bullets. But if you look at the data coming out of modularization, Emporium, hybrid, what you see is pockets of students use each of these well, and other pockets of students are devastated by them. So when we looked at the data on hybrid online instruction, who's a good user? Military folks. Because if you're in the military, you learn how to learn online. Really good users. And what we have, one of the videos we have that we don't show in Texas is this guy who just came back from Iraq. And he said, yeah, I really was sucked in high school math, but nothing like 4 years in Iraq to get you ready to learn how to factor. Military, women returning to the workforce who had good high school backgrounds but are frightened by the experience and are dislocated socially. Great users of online courses once they get the hang of it. And the handful of precocious 16 and 17-year-old high school students who do it by dual and concurrent enrollment, they eat up online instruction. 18-year-old students, men out of work, GED recipients, horrible users. In fact, MDRC, which does the randomized controlled trials, stopped the Virginia trials, almost like a medical stopping of a research project, because the failure rates were so high for those populations. Emporium, modularization. Modularization, there are a handful of students, far fewer than the administration believes, who are just missing a few topics. It's not like you had the flu that week and you missed the quadratic formula, and if we teach you the quadratic formula, everything's okay. Right, it's sort of a crazy idea, but there are a handful of students, maybe 5 or 6% of the population in North Carolina, who actually benefit from modularized assessment and filling in topics that they missed. Most people are rusty on everything, if they're rusty on anything. So when you think about the offerings, you're big enough to think about what are the modalities that you offer it through, and how do you get the right student in the right pathway at the right time. And this is where institutional research, academic mapping programs are getting better and better and better. But it's often disconnected from the faculty. The fourth, and this is the biggest, is the new research on student success in community college populations. The work of David Yeager, Greg Walton. Amazing work. If you want to see rigorous mathematical modeling of effects, picoeconomic modeling, hyperbolic discounting maps, we have really good predictive information now about low-income, ethnic minority, Caucasian white women, low-income Asian students in developmental math courses. And what have we learned? Much of the advising they get comes in a package that they can't use. It's not sequenced in the way that they actually encounter the problems. It's either too early or too late. But we noticed, and there's a beautiful paper called Practical Measurement that'll appear in Science in the next month or two. It's gone through a review that outlines the research. It shows there are 3 questions that our students ask themselves. And if they don't defer judgment about the answers or come up with answers, they withdraw their energy, hyperbolic discounting. By the 5th week, they either show up without their prefrontal cortex or they just disappear. And we could track the withdrawal of engagement and energy. What are the things we've learned? Capability. Almost all students who come to community college Dev Ed Math initially ask themselves, can I really do this stuff? They wonder deeply whether they're coming with positive momentum. They've made a positive choice. They have high aspirations. More than 80% of them want baccalaureate degrees. 20% of them want degrees that don't exist. They're just expressing a hope for a better life and achievement. But they wonder, can I really do this? Because they've never experienced anything like college. They're accustomed to a workplace where everything is directed, the tasks are clear, or high school, which is structured in a different way. So they say, can I do this? If they don't come up with an answer for that, you can track withdrawal of energy. And one way, if any of there are economists in here, instrumental variables, One way you track the withdrawal of energy is by tracking their adding discretionary hours at work. And David Yeager documented this. The second is, do I belong here? And they ask it in this form. And you can see it in the faces of your students. They say, are the people who succeed in these courses like me? And if they feel that they don't fit socially, they withdraw energy, and you can calculate the rates at which they withdraw their energy. Why is this important? Because mandatory orientation, well designed, messages that faculty give on the first day, noticing routines, profoundly affect belonging. And this is the work of Catherine Good, beautiful, beautiful research, who's a tenured psychology faculty at Baruch College. The third is purpose. Many of our students don't have clarity about the world they're trying to enter. They just have this inchoate sense of wanting a better life in which they can support a family, do something of value. There are some who really want to be a fireman, but many of our students in Dev Ed Math have a generalized hope for a better life. And they ask themselves a question about purpose. Is this effort and is this work actually connected to who I am? And if they don't come up with a positive answer, we've done interviews day by day, called DSM technology, push questionnaires, and if students don't have good answers or deferred judgment, you can see the withdrawal of energy. So what does this have to do with the beginning comments I made and that the speakers made? If they don't see that they can succeed in this world and belong, they're not going to learn the content that we're teaching. They will not put in the productive persistence that they need to actually succeed. The human bridge, the demystification of the process, is really important. And the biggest thing that needs to be demystified in math classes is the role of struggle. The faculty member, me, I'm constantly throwing problems at students that I think are just a little bit over their head. And sometimes I miss. I make it too easy, and they see that as disrespectful. Or I make it too hard and they feel incapable. But they think that hard problems are about them. They don't realize that we designed the problems to stress them and make them grow. So they're thinking, I don't belong here when they get a hard problem. And I'm trying to tell them, hey, look, I'm a professional mathematician. 90% of the time I'm confused. Right? People don't pay me to work on problems they know the answer to, right? And at least 3/4 of the time, what I do is I take the problem I'm working on and I turn it into an easier problem I can actually solve. Right? That's what mathematicians do for a living. And then it all accumulates and eventually it gets pieced together into a solution of maybe the problem or one bigger. But students don't know this. They're thinking, every single problem is a test of whether they belong or not. So we did a little video experiment. We took a few problems that seemed like you can do them, but actually are impossible. It was really fun making them up. We videotaped classes. We threw out the problem as a quiz, and half the students gave up before the other half even got a clue. So you could just see when you look at their faces, a lot of them are making the judgment, can I do this or not? They don't understand that the heart of STEM work is productive struggle. Nobody disassembles it for them and shapes their attributions. And now there's a lot that's being learned about this from the military. Survivability of soldiers, actually, is one of the areas where we're learning about these stresses. And we're learning that if you teach students study skills and you teach them that they always work, or if you teach them that they can get smarter by working harder, what happens when they fail is it reinforces the idea that they're incapable and don't belong. And what the military learned in training soldiers for survivability is that don't teach them how to survive. Give them a toolbox of things that might work with different probabilities. And when they experience failure, they expect it because no tool always works, and they're triggered to look for another tool and try that. And that's been shown to actually increase survivability of soldiers. And it's now been shown to dramatically increase the productive persistence of community college students. And you can read about this on the Carnegie Foundation website on their Start Strong program. So we have efforts that deal with content, but not these psychological issues. We have programs that deal with acceleration and modularization without changing the content. We have a lot of work in delivery without changing either the structure or the content. And then last is the faculty development. Of all industries on planet Earth, it's hard to imagine one in which less investment is made in frontline workers than community colleges. Almost usually the way it goes is, here's a problem to solve, faculty, you're now innovators. We work in like a fog of collective amnesia. So if I think of my mathematics, I teach statistical and econometric modeling, aggregation of producer price indices. In my doctoral classes now, and typically in doctoral classes, you start the class by asking what's happened around the world this week in this field. Because anything consequential in mathematics will be known almost instantly unless it's proprietary stuff or NSA stuff. And even then we mostly know because they're our students, right? So you have instant exchange of information. When you look at community colleges, there are almost no examples of people with the time to learn from others. So you look at Valencia, Brazosport, Walla Walla, massive increases in student success with low-income populations. But if you take another place, look at the good work that you've done here. Who's actually going to learn from it? Does everyone have to reinvent it by themselves? This is a structural problem in the field, and to address this, we have to look to our professional associations as vehicles for information sharing. So when you look at your DevEd math program, the data is pretty bleak. It's why I appreciated the president talking about successes, because the rhetoric around community colleges is a rhetoric of failure. We've got to be really careful here. Look at K-12. K-12 used to be a beacon of hope in American society. Now it's broadly perceived as a symbol of government failure, because all the efforts to improve it were based around its failures and not its successes. And that's now happening to community colleges. Public support of community colleges is dropping. In America, we're addicted to the idea that you can only improve if there's a catastrophe. We have to be very careful. All this data-driven improvement, you don't learn from data. As a guy who teaches advanced econometric modeling, I'll tell you, you don't learn anything from data unless you can see the faces of your students in it. And when you make changes in institutional practice, the first thing that gets killed off are the terrible things and the wonderful things because they're idiosyncratic. So one of the first steps in improvement is to be rock solid clear about what you're actually doing well and what the evidence is for it. If you don't have clarity about what you're excelling at, you have a high risk in making any change. So think of it, improvement around excellence with a knowledge of weakness. Now, if you do these things, as Quantway, Statway, New Mathways Project, ALP at Baltimore Community College, what are the results? Independently assessed, randomized controlled trials, or sophisticated modeling. Nationally, 8 to 12% of students, depending on the state, who are placed in remediation, ever pass a college credit math course. In all of these, the lowest number of successes is 55% of students passing a college credit math course in 1 year. So they triple or quadruple the success rate in half or a third of the time. So one shouldn't muck around lightly with established structures in higher ed. The bar should be really, really high. But on DevEd, the bar is really high. putting GED students back in elementary algebra, especially after they just passed it. Using AccuPlacer instead of looking at high school grades for students coming out of good schools is a really bad idea. Structured, intense programs that are connected, relevant to students' programs of study are much better. But you also have to change the structures around them. And what are they? Placement. 3 years ago, the AccuPlacer website said to students who went on it, which were very few, don't study for this test, it will give you a false reading. We knew that more than half of students who took the placement test did it at the end of an orientation. They had no knowledge that it was actually so important. It used to be seen as a low-stakes instrument. So we have lots of our students taking these placement tests when they're rusty. They haven't spent a day or two reviewing. And we're seeing more and more colleges have students sign a legal disclosure of the consequence, because in California they did that, and students saved 1.5 courses on average by 3 days of studying for the test. Massive change. So A, it is a criminal enterprise, and the College Board and ACT are reworking their placement tests. Don't rely on a $2 test to put students back a semester or two. Right? Be aggressive. Put them in college courses if they're even close, and build up the support. What does build up the support mean? We've interviewed tutors and learning center personnel. They're like the first, second, third week of the term, they're clinically depressed because no one shows up to speak to the tutors. The model seems to be the students will discover they're in trouble. They'll seek out help because they know from a friend. Then they'll go to the tutoring center and get tutored. Well, I'm like an actual math teacher, as most of you are. If you're a week behind in my math class, you're not going to catch up. It's a crazy idea that you can catch up when you're 3 weeks behind in a math course, especially when you're working and have 12 other units. So what are colleges doing? The first 3 weeks of the term, all the tutors are in the classes with the math faculty under their supervision. The advisors and college advisors in the first few weeks spend more time in the classes with the students, getting to know them, under faculty direction. Big cultural changes when students go into their first class and they meet the people whose job is to support them, as opposed to going out and finding them. So this is the changing landscape of Dev Ed math. And I just want to end with this. So Texas, all 50 community college systems, 181 math departments have agreed to working on changing and getting rid of Dev Ed math, intensifying it, and doing research on alternative approaches for students with basic arithmetic problems. 28,000 students in the quant way and stat way. The data, the bar has been met. If you have courses in which none of the students are ever going to pass a college credit course or a certificate exam, we have to ask hard questions about why these exist. But there are enough models out there sanctioned by the professional societies to risk making change. When you do, make sure you know what you're doing well and don't screw that up. So why is this really important? So I go to a community college in Brooklyn, which has to be the worst community college I've ever been at. There are all these faculty who wish they had different students. You go into a faculty meeting and they're actually public, that's not here, right? Just listening to you talking, a lot of people talking with respect about students, that's a place where they're not talking about the students with respect. And they're in this gigantic fight about whether they should teach quadratic equation solving by completing the square or factoring. 2-hour fight. I'm going, listening to this. And you think of the purpose of this. Americans are a wonderful people, but we have some character faults. One of them is we prefer nostalgia to actual history. And people believe that democracy is always going to be here because of the founding fathers or some documents that are in a case in the Library of Congress. Democracies are extremely fragile, as those who know about the Weimar Republic and other pieces of history understand. And what makes democracies work? Social contract and the belief that you can improve your standing and your child's standing through education or hard work and effort. That was true 50 years ago. It hasn't been true in the US for 50 years. What are the roots to upward mobility? For poor people, the military, that is way downsized. Fewer and fewer poor people are going into the military now. Government jobs, being a postal worker, critical for the African American, rise of the African American middle class. Public service jobs, government jobs, they're the fastest declining sector of the economy. Small businesses used to be an engine of upward mobility, not anymore. In fact, 60 and 70-year-olds are getting the jobs that 20-year-olds need. And by the way, about a third of the nursing licenses in community colleges are going to people who already have BAs. Right? So we're seeing those routes are closed off. The last route is education in community colleges. We're the vehicle of upward social and economic mobility. It's the story of most of our lives. Most of us got where we are by virtue of education. We have to reflect on the purposes. Let's not fight about the rigor of an arithmetic course. Let's make sure it's connected to students' futures and has mathematical integrity. And we don't define integrity in terms of a list of topics from 1952. So being interested in history, our library at UT Austin has many of the old CUPM and MAA and AMATIC documents. They collect them as archivists. And I went back and said, where does DevEd math come from? The old joke, it has to be damp, right? Where does it come from? 1950s, there were discussions about how we should compensate for the large number of high school students and military GI people via GI Bill coming back to school without basic academic credentials. So when you read the minutes, at that time community colleges were mostly connected still to high schools. They were just separating off from high schools. Many of them were run by the same boards. And all the people on the committee were middle school and high school teachers. And the first thing they said is, these students need time to mature, so let's stretch out the sequence. Look at your students. The last thing they need is time to mature. Give any more time to mature and they'll over-ripen and rot. Right? This DevEd sequence is a product of 1950s time that has nothing to do with the world of our students. Think of the student services. Where did it come from? In 1950s, the faculty in this room would have been responsible for advising and student support directly, and it would have been in their contracts. Why did it change? Because the GI Bill was opposed by the faculty, and the administration saw it as political. So they created, usually in the basement of the administration building first, student service offices, and they professionalized advising. And then when civil rights came in, the first African Americans and Latinos on campuses, highly political, so the administration took responsibility. When the administration created student learning centers, the faculty didn't rise up and say, if they're the student learning center, what the hell are we? Now you look at Essex, and it looks like America. 50 years ago, it probably looked like Taiwan and Vermont had merged in an earthquake. Right? You've dramatically changed, democratized access to higher ed, but there are still two bureaucracies responsible for student success. And the CESI data shows that a lot of the student affairs people see themselves as the saviors of the students, helping them deal with truculent faculty. And the faculty very rarely know the student support personnel whose job is to support their students. We need to change that, and that has to start by human reaching out, connecting around the students that we jointly serve. So summary, institutional strengths, which are many, and I think you're blessed with really good leaders. This blessed business, you learned to say in Texas, by the way. I didn't learn that in New York. You have a lot of strengths. Understand them, defend them with data, don't screw them up. When you look at Dev Ed Math, ask harder questions about who should be in what sequence. Figure out which students would benefit from more intensive instruction and how to organize that instruction efficiently. Don't believe in magic bullets for delivery. It'll take you a while to figure out who to channel where and how to do the channeling. Learn about the new student success work because it's powerful predictors of student energization and commitment. And think about the professional work of your societies because that's the most efficient way to contribute to the national discussion and to learn from others. I hope this has been helpful to you. And what I'd like to do is just give you 2 minutes to formulate questions. I'm like a real classroom teacher. I know I don't just ask for questions. So just take 2 or 3 minutes and ask your neighbor what you'd really like to know more about. And then I'll call on people, which is what I usually do.
Okay, Dr. Treisman, we have our first question back here.
No, they didn't take 2 minutes to perfect it. Don't ask it to me until you work on it with a neighbor.
Hello and welcome. I wanted to know, I run a summer program, and I would say that most of the students, except for maybe 3, are placed in the first level of math, which here is Math 86. Yeah. And then some of them...
That's a basic introduction to algebra?
Yes, the first one. And then it goes to another one?
Arithmetic.
Is that algebra?
Yeah.
Huh? Arithmetic, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
See, I know I'm not a math teacher, so that's why. So I wanted to know if they keep failing the same class, what do you do? Should we just put them on to the next class? Because a lot of them give up and they don't graduate.
If they keep failing the class, it's the class that's broken, not the students. If it's a regular person, if it's one student, it could be the student. But if most of the students are failing and taking it over and over again, you have a broken course. And the first question to ask, and you can learn a lot from the Washington Community College faculty who worked on this as part of their accreditation requirements. Some really beautiful work. They found, in fact, that a lot of those students were looking at level 1 certificates. The institution was preparing them for things that they weren't really aiming for or had a realistic shot at getting. So the idea was, let's prepare them for their first job with their eye on a second and third. Initiate a cycle of continuous learning and upgrading of skills. And what they did is they took those crappy pre-algebra arithmetic courses and they merged them and integrated them into their basic workforce courses. It's called iBest. And they saw significant numbers of students succeeding. The second place to look is Ivy Tech system in Indiana. They took all the level 1 certificate exams and they analyzed the math content. And they organized that content around certification so that students saw the items in the actual Hobbit exam or in basic nursing licensing exams. Dramatically increased motivation and actually led to a significant shift in what students were learning in those courses. And for the math people, what did they find? The exams require much more careful attention to precision and place value than usually appears in arithmetic, which is more about computation. That was one thing that students were missing in all the placement and licensing exams. Proportional reasoning and understanding how to use it flexibly rather than just outright computation. So there's a lot known about this. And Ivy Tech took that knowledge, commissioned the study, and redesigned those entry-level courses. If most of your students are failing and it happens over and over, you're not going to solve the problem by fixing the students. You're going to solve it by fixing the course. Other questions? The lights are such that I can't see any of you. So I'll just point over here.
The students are not broken, but the students that we have, and I'm sure you're familiar with these kind of students, they have so many other demands on their life.
Yes.
They've got kids, they've got jobs, they've got everything else. So they start missing classes.
Right.
They get sick, they miss a week. Their kid has asthma, they miss 2 weeks. They can't catch up. So I think that that causes some of our students to give up much too early. So a lot of the stuff you said about trying to engage them and let them see that they can succeed is important, but they have to understand too that when their life intervenes, they have to make the effort to stay on board. And I think that that's one of the reasons I see my students dropping out early on.
Yeah.
Yeah, with the lowest level, not the highest.
Yeah.
The second one is academic issues.
So let me just respond to this and then, so there's good research on this. And our students are diverse and have complex lives. And there are students women, I just interviewed a woman who was working 45 hours a week with 2 kids, no partner, and taking 15 units. And she just like crashed under the weight of it. She just broke down. But those students, as the research shows, are actually exceptional, and they stand out, those stories of life happens, because they are so exceptional. When you look at the broad mass of students in the middle, they have much more flexibility, and we can see that by tracking hours worked in workforce data sets. So productive persistence, orientation, purpose will increase on average the number of students who make it through. And yes, given our population, it's not going to be 100%. But the narrative has become around the exceptions. We need to think of the structural things in our courses that move the middle. How do we do orientation? How do we address belonging, purpose, and capability? Noticing routines. So what you see now in community college level 1 classes, this is called the noticing routine from emerging scholars. The classes start by the students naming all the people who are missing and putting their names on the board. If they're missing twice, someone in the class calls them up and the faculty member emails them both. Dramatic increases in student attendance if this starts in week 1. If students know that their name is going to be on the board when they're missing, a few students react negatively. The great majority of students react positively because it ties into this belonging. So the question is, what are the routine structures and rituals we can put in the courses to help more, but not all of our students succeed, and not be overly influenced by exceptional dramatic cases? How about here? How about here, and then I'll come there.
Okay.
There's one movement that iVest and QuantWay and StatWay are representing, where they're trying to formulate the content that is efficient for the career path that the student is pursuing.
Yeah.
And they're trying to strip away the things that are just not directly relevant to the success of that student in that career pathway. But there is an alternative movement, which is to make the developmental courses conform to the Common Core.
Yes.
And the Common Core is very broad
Yep.
and covers lots of stuff.
Yep.
And if you were to look at our current math course, our current developmental math course is aligned with our college level math course.
Yeah.
And it is 90% algebra.
Yeah.
And if we try to conform to the Common Core, we're going to double the content
Yep.
in that course. So,
It's a great question. Yeah.
so where do we go? Do we go broad to the Common
Yeah.
Core, or do we go narrow to career focus?
So I
And
wrestle
I see
with
those
this.
as conflicting
You
directions.
get conflicting directions. Since I worked on the Common Core, on the development team of it, and I designed the QuantWay and StatWay curriculum, you can see I'm schizophrenic about it. So here's what I've come out. Thank you for asking that question, because we're getting different policy signals. What was the most fulfilling thing about the iBest and the Quantway and Statway and New Mathway project programs is that a significant number of students, when they have a success in mathematics, get this radicalized liberation theology. You mean I can actually do this shit? I want now, it emboldens them to raise their aspirations. And that's been found by Rosa Serra, by independent ethnographers. Math has this strange cultural idea that somehow it's harder than art history or playing the clarinet. There's some mythology around this that's not grounded in reality, that's really a conceit. And when students understand that they can succeed, and this is a big problem for Statway, Quantway, and New Mathways project, which we're shifting now to build bridge courses that allow people to go back into pre-calculus, calculus. That's the major area of development of the whole New Mathway project now. Because so many of the students who succeeded say, now I want to do something with math in it. The Common Core has a big problem. First of all, it's collapsing under its own weight, and states are pulling out of it left and right because states and people hate the fact that the Gates Foundation and others are manipulating them, and the technocrats trying to solve things. It's probably it's going under, but New Jersey is still a place where it's strong, going up. Your governor has decided to go against the other Republican governors, but 10-1, he's going to pull out or pull back because it'll become a primary challenge issue in the presidential election if he runs for office. We'll see big changes in this. But here are the problems with the Common Core. It was designed for high school K-12 students. Half of your students are not coming directly from high school, is that right? 60%?
We're climbing in our traditional age student population.
Is it 80% of the students coming directly?
Maybe 70.
Two-thirds, a third, maybe, something like that. So first of all, if you look at the Common Core stuff, Park, it's not, what about the third of the students coming back to work who didn't have this high school curriculum? The purpose of high school is to prepare people very broadly for many things. It doesn't have to be the purpose of community colleges. Community colleges can prepare people, again, for a better job and better life with their eye on even a better one, which our job is igniting and initiating cycles of continual improvement and learning. So I think the argument for using the Common Core, adding more content into the community college curriculum will in fact just massively increase failure rates. Will not be a good thing. Not that you have a choice necessarily. But at least the leadership, of the math reform movement, you look at Tipsy Me, the high-end folks in that movement are saying don't confuse the Common Core with college entrance requirements or placement courses. That's going to be a big fight. So I get it. No perfect answer. But I think you have to advocate for your students. And if your students are here for a better job, they need to have roots to it, and they shouldn't be held to today's high school curriculum if they graduated 10 years ago. Other questions? Over there was one.
Well, unfortunately, we're out of time. We have to make room for the next session. But I would like everybody to help me and welcome me in actually thanking Dr. Treisman for his presentation.
Thank you.